to Washington this week. We will look at the challenge he faces when it comes to getting more funding for the war with Russia. Former US President Donald Trump reverses course when it comes to testifying in court later today. This as he doubles down on startling comments about being a dictator if he gets in the White House for a second term. And homes turn to rubble and ash in Gaza after an Israeli airstrike. What the US has to say about civilian protection in the beleaguered enclave.
Live from Atlanta, this is CNN Newsroom with Rosemary Church.
Thanks for joining us. We start with the Ukrainian president making his third trip to Washington since Russia invaded his country nearly 2 years ago. A statement from Volodymyr Zelensky's office says he will meet with US President Biden about further defense cooperation. But right now, aid for Ukraine is bogged down in Congress amid a long-running domestic debate, with some lawmakers saying it comes down to a matter of priorities. CNN's Kevin Liptak has more.
President Zelensky's visit to Washington on Tuesday will come at a critical moment as lawmakers are working to come up with a package that would include new aid for Ukraine, along with new rules on migration into the United States. And certainly the fact that President Biden invited Zelensky to visit Washington tells you that the administration is looking for some kind of dramatic way to break the impasse on Capitol Hill. So while he is in D.C., he will meet with President Biden at the White House to discuss what President Biden's aides say is vital American support for Ukraine, but he will also be on Capitol Hill. Zelensky will speak to all senators at a meeting in person, and he will meet as well with the Republican House Speaker, Mike Johnson. And certainly his challenge will be in convincing some of these skeptical Republicans that the $60 billion in additional American assistance that President Biden is requesting for Ukraine could make a difference on the battlefield, as Ukraine remains bogged down in this counteroffensive that hasn't necessarily changed the battle lines so far. But already you're hearing some Republicans sort of oppose Zelensky's visit. J.D. Vance, the conservative Republican from Ohio, said that Zelensky will come to Washington and demand that Congress care more about his border than our own. And remember, these talks are tied together with this conversation about tightening the rules on migration into the United States. We did hear Sunday from the two senators who are sort of leading those discussions, the Democrat Chris Murphy and the Republican James Lankford. It did not appear as if they were any closer to an agreement. Listen to what they said.
I think this is one of the most dangerous moments that I've ever faced in American politics, and I wish Republicans weren't holding Israel aid and aid to Ukraine hostage to the resolution of immigration reform.
Can you get Ukraine aid passed separate from this?
No. The focus is what you hear from so many people is, why would we deal with other people's national security and ignore American national security? Why would we literally allow people across our southern border this administration labels national security risks by the thousands coming into the country, separate from just the migrants that are coming from employment? We have individuals they've literally labeled national security risks coming into the country. Why would we not work to be able to stop that? We can't do two things at once.
Now, President Biden did say last week that he was open to significant compromise when it comes to border provisions, but he is really caught in a bind here, feeling pressure from both sides, certainly from Republicans and even some Democrats who want to do more to stop the migrant flows from coming into the United States, but also on the other side from progressives and immigration advocates who are worried about the steps that President Biden might agree to, worried that they could amount to some of the restrictive policies that President Trump enacted when he was in office. Now, we did hear from Senator Chris Murphy today that the White House plans to become more engaged on these talks over the coming weeks, but it remains certainly unclear whether presidential involvement will break the impasse. Kevin Liptak, CNN, Los Angeles.
So let's discuss this further with CNN contributor Jill Doherty, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. She's also a former CNN Moscow bureau chief. Good to have you with us.
Hey, Rosemary.
So President Joe Biden will host Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House Tuesday to discuss further defense cooperation. But of course, hanging over that series of planned talks is the reality that Congress is not fully on board with additional funding for the war-torn nation. So what all can possibly be achieved?
Well, I think Zelensky's got a very difficult job, and this really may be the biggest, most important pitch that he has to make for his country. Because right now, as was just noted in that report, everything in the United States has been highly politicized. Obviously, we have an election coming up. And so any issue, and especially Ukraine, where you're talking about, big amounts of money, you've got this package, overall package of $106 billion, $60 billion of which would go to Ukraine. The rest would go to Israel, to the border, and some other, Taiwan, in fact. But 60 billion is a lot of money. And as American lawmakers look at it, they don't believe that there's much progress that the Ukrainians are making. And also they know, at least the Republicans know, that Joe Biden is really kind of over the barrel on this. He needs to continue that funding. That is a major purpose that he set out to do. And so they can hold him and they can pressure him on this issue of the border. Now, the Russians are saying security, the border is security. But there's, I think you'd have to say, a difference between armed invasion of another country, albeit another country, and people coming into a country. They're quite different issues, but in the United States right now, they are intricately connected. And so it's very difficult. And I think Zelensky is going to have to rely on the power that he has emotionally to connect to people, but also to make that get across that idea, which he's made before, that if Ukraine loses, whatever lose means at this point, and Russia is perceived as winning, that it can be a danger to Europe and to the United States. So it's a very, very difficult task for him right now.
Yeah, let's look at that, because what will the likely consequences be if conservatives dig in their heels and refuse to approve more aid for Ukraine? What will be the consequences? Paint us that picture.
Well, it's pretty dire, because right now the whole thing, the whole fight in Ukraine right now is about how much armaments you have, how much ammunition do you have, how many weapons do you have, and Ukraine is running out of this. In fact, it's quite predictable that soon, within weeks or certainly in months, that they could run out of equipment that they need to fight this war. Meanwhile, Russia has been getting drones and ammunition, drones from Iran, ammunition from North Korea, in fact, quite a lot of it. So this is the difficulty right now, that if Ukraine runs out of ammunition, the Russians will come in. They're already beginning that kind of winter offensive on the energy resources of Ukraine, trying to cut down on heating and electric for the Ukrainians, making it very difficult, as they did last year. And nobody knows exactly where that will all end, but it's a pretty dire, serious situation. Biden knows that, and certainly Zelensky knows that. That is why he's making this, you could say, last-minute trip to the United States, going up to Capitol Hill and trying to make that pitch. The problem, I think, Rosemary, is when he talks to the Senate, there actually are some Republicans who support him in the Senate. But when you get to the House, that is where the conservatives are, and you could say really very far right conservatives who are opposed to Ukraine entirely, do not want to aid Ukraine. And they can make this argument that can seem convincing, American security. And that's difficult when you try to say helping another country will help the United States. It doesn't appear to be a direct link to some Americans.
And Jill, while we have you with us, what is your take on where the relationship stands right now between Russia's President Vladimir Putin and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after their talks Sunday, when Putin offered to help de-escalate the conflict in Gaza in response to civilian casualties there?
Well, certainly Netanyahu is not happy with Putin. There's no question. Putin has been, well, and in fact, they invited Hamas representatives to Moscow a while ago. Putin has been very, very critical of the Israeli occupation, of the Israeli operation. I think what you're seeing is Russia trying to exploit divisions between the United States and, let's say, Israel, and the problems that the United States is having in the Arab world in general. And then also Russia and Putin trying to look very much like a power broker, trying to show that they still have influence. Recently, over the past few years, their influence has waned. But right now, you'd have to say that Putin is making the pitch to become or to be perceived as a power broker in the Middle East.
Jill Doherty joining us from Berlin. Many thanks. Appreciate your analysis on this issue.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Zelensky spent Sunday in Argentina congratulating the country's new president, Javier Milei, on his inauguration. The two held a bilateral meeting after the swearing-in ceremony. The Ukrainian president posted that Argentina and Ukraine are united by their love for freedom, writing, "We truly cherish it, protect it, and stand ready to strengthen it together." Zelensky also made time to meet with the presidents of Ecuador, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Well, former President Donald Trump changed course Sunday, announcing on social media that he will not testify today in his $250 million New York civil fraud trial. Just Friday, Trump had declared that he would take the stand in the case once again against the advice of his attorneys. But on social media Sunday, he said he won't testify after all. Trump, his adult sons, and his company are accused of inflating the value of their properties to receive better loan and insurance terms, allegations he vehemently denies. The Republican presidential frontrunner also has been taking heat for a second-term agenda that would wield executive power in unprecedented ways, and for his recent comments on whether he would be a dictator. Former Democratic Vice President Al Gore told CNN that Trump's statements should be taken seriously.
Well, I saw the other day where he pledged to be a dictator on day one, and you kind of wonder what it'll take for people to believe him when he tells us who he is.
On Saturday, Trump tried to reframe the narrative that he would be a threat to democracy, calling the accusation a hoax. CNN's Elena Treen has more.
Well, Donald Trump, speaking at an event last night hosted by the New York Young Republican Club, doubled down on comments that he had made during a town hall with Fox News earlier in the week. And he essentially said that he would be a dictator for one day if he reclaimed the White House in order to build a wall and to, quote, drill, drill, drill. But Trump also attempted last night to undercut the narrative that he would be a threat to democracy by characterizing it as a new hoax cooked up by Democrats. Take a listen.
In the past few weeks, the radical left Democrats and their fake news allies have unveiled their newest hoax that Donald J. Trump and the Republican Party are a threat to democracy. Do you believe it? That's what it is. It's a hoax. It's a new, we call it now, the threat to democracy hoax. That's what it is.
The former president also repeated claims last night that he thinks Joe Biden is the, quote, real threat to democracy. And so I think, there's a couple things worth pointing out here. There is a concern, and I've spoken about this with Donald Trump's advisors and other Republicans, that some of this ramped up rhetoric is not going to play well outside of his loyal base, especially if he were to go on and win the Republican nomination and then advance to the general election. I think that's why you're seeing Donald Trump, as we've seen him do time and time again, to reclaim the narrative on this. And that's essentially what he's doing. He's trying to flip the script and put this on Joe Biden. He's claiming that this is an artificial narrative being spread by Democrats when really Biden is the one who's using the government to go after him and his political enemies, pointing to the series of indictments that he is facing. But, that's not really an argument that seems to be resonating outside of Donald Trump's closest group of supporters. And of course, there's also no evidence that the White House has had any involvement in the indictments against Trump. Now, I do also think it's very important for us to be clear about the greater context of this, which is that Trump himself has said publicly that if he were to reclaim the White House in 2024, he would use the Justice Department to go after his political foes. And his team has already been formulating plans to move the Justice Department under presidential control and try to strengthen the power of the executive branch. Now, another thing I think is just very interesting is the unintended consequences of Donald Trump continuing to talk about this. And that is that it's giving Joe Biden and the Democratic Party an opening. What Democrats have been trying to do is paint the election as not only a rematch between Trump and Biden, but a choice between authoritarianism and democracy. And so this is just another opening for Democrats to use to go after Donald Trump. Elena Treen, CNN, Washington.
Meantime, two of Donald Trump's biggest Republican rivals in the presidential race are looking to boost their profiles ahead of the Iowa caucuses. The attacks between Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley are getting personal, with Haley accusing DeSantis of being a phony, saying he's too similar to Donald Trump in a new political ad.
We're going to build the wall.
Build the wall.
Project to get
Judges are a
treatment
priority.
available and honestly,
Dump
made in China and
and
shipped here.
Russia.
Businesses that have been locked down.
What a phony.
Meanwhile, DeSantis accuses Haley of pretending to be two different candidates on the campaign trail.
You can't have Hawkeye Haley here saying she's conservative, and then more nuanced Nikki appealing to independents and liberals in New Hampshire. That doesn't work. You got to have the same message everywhere.
Earlier, I asked CNN senior political analyst Ron Brownstein about why neither candidate has been able to effectively challenge Trump and what it means for the race going forward.
Their common problem is that neither one at the moment is attracting a coalition broad enough to really threaten Trump. They have also jointly made the decision that they are largely going to defer to another day, making the strongest possible case against Trump and focus on trying to edge out each other to get him into a one-on-one race. They are operating from completely different theories about what it takes to beat him. DeSantis is running to Trump's right, trying to peel away some of his core supporters on the theory that if he gets it down to a one-on-one race, that the voters in the middle will have no choice but to rally around him as the last chance to stop Trump. But that strategy, Rosemary, really hasn't paid a lot of dividends. He hasn't peeled away a lot of Trump supporters, and he's alienated a lot of the more centrist voters in the Republican Party who are the most resistant to Trump. That's left the vacuum for Haley, which she has filled to probably pass him as the most viable alternative to Trump, consolidating those more centrist voters, college-educated voters, suburban voters. But that last debate showed the limits of her approach. When DeSantis and Ramaswamy really tag team, went at her from the right, and she didn't have, I think, as effective a response as she did in some of the earlier debates.
Still to come, urgent calls for more humanitarian aid for Gaza as the war there